In the year 1890, a woman could not vote. She could not own property after marriage. She could not attend university. But she could build an empire out of silk, feathers, and a single wooden block. There were women in London who did exactly that, women who understood something that the law did not. That the first thing the world sees when it meets you is not your name, not your fortune, not your family crest. It is the thing that sits upon your head. In the narrow workshops above the elegant shops of Burlington Arcade, these women, the milliners, shaped not just felt and straw, but the very way a person walked into a room. And the hats they made did not simply sit on heads, they changed who people believed they were. Come in, dear visitor. Come in from the spring rain. I can hear it tapping against the window, light as fingertips on glass. Here, let me take your coat. There we are. And do sit down by the fire. The kettle has just boiled, and the evening is young enough for a story. Now then, I see you have noticed this little beauty on the shelf. Here, let me show you. Feel the velvet, still soft, even after all these years. This deep emerald green, this particular shade, was not easy to come by in 1890. It had to be dyed 3 times to reach this depth of colour. And look here, these tiny silk violets along the brim, each one stitched by hand, with thread so fine you can barely see it. There is a single ostrich feather, curled just so, tucked behind a ribbon of ivory lace. But the secret, dear visitor, the real treasure, is hidden inside. Turn it over, gently now. There, do you see it? A tiny embroidered rose, no larger than your thumbnail, stitched in crimson thread. That was her signature. Every hat that left her workshop carried one of these little roses, tucked where only the wearer would know. This hat belonged to a young woman named Charlotte Webb, but it was made by someone rather extraordinary. Let me tell you the story of Miss Rosemary Plunkett, milliner, artist, and one of the most remarkable women I have ever had the pleasure of knowing through the things she left behind. The morning began, as it always did, with light. Not the harsh white light of summer, but the soft silvered light of an April morning in London, filtering through the tall windows of the workshop above Burlington Arcade. It fell across the wooden floorboards in long, pale rectangles, catching the dust motes that drifted lazily through the air, and it illuminated the room in a way that made everything look as though it had been painted in watercolours. Rosemary Plunkett climbed the narrow staircase from the shop below, her boots making a familiar rhythm on each step. She was 35 years old, with hair the colour of autumn leaves pinned up in a loose arrangement that was practical rather than fashionable, and green eyes that missed nothing. Her dress was a deep plum colour, simple but well cut, with sleeves rolled to the elbow. The dress of a woman who worked with her hands and was proud of it. The workshop was her kingdom. Along one wall stood a row of wooden hat blocks, smooth, pale forms shaped like heads without faces, each one carved from whitewood that had been dried for months in heated rooms before it was ready for use. Some were round, some oval, some with high crowns and some with flat ones, each designed for a different style. They looked, Rosemary had always thought, like a silent audience waiting for a performance. On the opposite wall, shelves rose from floor to ceiling, and they were filled with colour. Bolts of silk in sapphire blue and rose pink, rolls of velvet in burgundy and forest green, spools of ribbon in every shade imaginable, gold, silver, lavender, cream, coral, midnight. Boxes of ostrich feathers, their plumes soft as clouds. Bunches of artificial flowers, roses, violets, camellias, lily of the valley. So perfectly made that you had to touch them to know they were not real. There were trays of glass beads, drawers of lace, bags of horsehair for stiffening, and neat stacks of the pale pearly leghorn straw that arrived each spring from Italy. And on the large work table in the centre of the room, pinned to a board, was the sketch Rosemary had made the previous evening. A wide-brimmed hat for Royal Ascot with sweeping ostrich plumes and a band of gold ribbon. Beneath it, in her neat handwriting, she had written, Mrs. Harrington, June. Rosemary hung her shawl on the hook by the door, tied on her work apron, and stood for a moment looking at the sketch. She could already see the hat in her mind, not flat on the paper, but alive, three-dimensional, sitting at a slight angle on Mrs. Harrington's head, the plumes catching the wind at the racecourse. This was the part she loved most, the moment before the making, when the hat existed only as a possibility. She was still studying the sketch when the door opened and a small whirlwind of blonde hair and damp fabric burst into the room. Daisy Morris was 16, bright-eyed and breathless, and she had been Rosemary's apprentice for just over a year. She was the daughter of a tailor on Savile Row. Her father had paid the apprenticeship fee himself, which was no small thing, and she had the quick hands and keen eye that Rosemary looked for in a student. "Good morning, Miss Plunkett," Daisy said, unwinding her scarf. She spotted the sketch immediately. "Oh, is that the Ascot Commission? It is beautiful." "It will be," Rosemary said, "when it exists in more than pencil and paper. Come here, I want to show you something." She led Daisy to the row of hat blocks and lifted two from the shelf. One was tall and narrow, with a crown like a chimney pot. The other was low and round, with a wide, flat top. "What do you see?" Rosemary asked. Daisy studied them. "Two blocks, miss. One tall, one flat. And if I put the tall one on Mrs. Harrington, who has a round, full face, what happens?" Daisy tilted her head. "It would make her face look longer." "Exactly. The shape must follow the face, not fight it. A round face needs height to balance it, a tall crown, a vertical trim. An angular face needs softness, curves, wide brims, flowers close to the cheek." Rosemary set the blocks down. "A hat is not a decoration, Daisy. It is a conversation between the hat and the face beneath it. If they are not speaking the same language, no amount of feathers will save it." Daisy nodded seriously, then picked up a pencil and paper. "May I try a sketch, miss?" Rosemary smiled. That is exactly what I was going to suggest. She watched as Daisy bent over the paper, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the grate. She remembered being that age herself, standing in her Aunt Nell's workshop in Cheapside, holding a hat block for the first time, and thinking it felt like holding someone's future in her hands. Aunt Nell had taken her on when Rosemary was 14. Her parents had not been wealthy, but her father, a clerk at a shipping office, had scraped together the apprenticeship fee because he believed his daughter deserved a trade of her own. It was the greatest gift anyone had ever given her. By 9:30, the morning light had strengthened, and Rosemary and Daisy set out for the market. This was a journey they made every week, and Rosemary treated it with the seriousness of a general surveying a battlefield. The fabric market near Soho was a wonderland of colour and texture, and stepping into it was like stepping into a painting that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Stalls spilled out onto the pavement, draped with silks that rippled in the breeze like water, velvets that seemed to absorb the light, and muslins so fine they were nearly transparent. The air smelled of dye and sizing, and underneath it all, the faint sweetness of cotton dust. There were rolls of ribbon stacked like firewood, boxes of buttons sorted by size and colour, and great bundles of feathers tied with string, ostrich plumes from South Africa, pheasant tails from the English countryside, tiny songbird feathers dyed in impossible colours. Rosemary moved through the stalls with practised ease, her fingers trailing over fabrics as she walked. She did not simply look at materials. She felt them, listened to them, held them up to the light. "Feel this," she said to Daisy, pressing a length of burgundy velvet into her hands. "What does it tell you?" Daisy stroked the fabric. "It is soft, heavy, rich. And this?" Rosemary handed her a piece of pale blue silk. "Light," Daisy said. "Cool. Like water." "The velvet wants to be a winter hat," Rosemary said. "Something warm and close. The silk wants to be a summer hat, something that breathes and catches the light. You must listen to the material, Daisy. It will tell you what it wants to become." They bought the burgundy velvet for Mrs. Harrington's Ascot hat, along with 3 ostrich plumes, long, curling, impossibly soft, and a spool of gold ribbon that gleamed like something from a treasure chest. The ostrich plumes had travelled a very long way to reach this market stall. They had come from South Africa, where ostriches were farmed on vast flat plains, and from there they had been shipped to London, where women in workshops along the East End dyed them, steamed them, and curled them into the shapes that fashion demanded. A single plume of the highest quality could cost as much as a working man earned in a week. Rosemary handled them with the reverence they deserved. She also bought a length of dove-grey silk, though she did not yet know what it was for. Sometimes, she told Daisy, you buy the fabric first and let the hat find you later. The best hats I have ever made began as accidents. A colour that caught my eye, a feather that seemed to call out from a pile. "You must stay open to the unexpected, Daisy. It is where the best work comes from." They returned to the shop just before noon, their basket heavy with treasures, and found Mrs. Harrington already waiting in the fitting room downstairs. Margaret Harrington was a woman who filled a room the way a brass band fills a concert hall, completely and without apology. She was 45, with pink cheeks and a bosom that preceded her like the prow of a ship, and she wore her confidence the way other women wore perfume. She had been coming to Rosemary's shop for 3 years, ever since her previous milliner had retired, and she knew exactly what she wanted. "Miss Plunkett," she said, rising from the velvet chair, "I have been thinking about Ascot. I want something magnificent, something that says—" She paused, searching for the word. "Arrival." Rosemary nodded and produced her sketch. "I had the same thought, Mrs. Harrington. Wide brim, burgundy velvet, with 3 ostrich plumes arranged here," she pointed, "and a gold ribbon band. The brim will sweep upward on the left side to frame your face." Mrs. Harrington studied the sketch, then looked at Rosemary with the expression of a woman who has found exactly what she was looking for. "Yes," she said simply, "that is it." They spent the next half hour discussing details, the exact angle of the plumes, the width of the ribbon, whether the brim should have a wire edge or a soft roll. Rosemary made notes in her little book and held fabric samples against Mrs. Harrington's face, watching how the colour changed with her complexion, how the light played differently with each shade. "Royal Ascot," Mrs. Harrington explained to Daisy, who had been listening from the doorway, was the most important event of the racing season. Every lady of society would be there, and every lady would be wearing a new hat. It was a milliner's busiest time of year. The weeks leading up to June were a frenzy of sketches, fittings, last-minute alterations, and the occasional tearful client who had changed her mind about everything. For Rosemary, Ascot season meant long hours, aching fingers, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that her work would be seen by the finest women in England. When Mrs. Harrington left, the bell above the door chiming behind her, Rosemary stood in the empty shop for a moment with the sketch in her hands. She could feel the hat taking shape already, not in her fingers, but somewhere behind her eyes, in that space where imagination and skill overlapped. The making of a hat is a slow thing, a patient thing, and it begins not with fabric but with wood. Rosemary selected a block from the shelf, a wide, gently curved form with a shallow crown, and set it on the work table. She ran her hands over its surface, feeling for imperfections, though she knew there were none. This block had belonged to Aunt Nell, and it was as smooth as riverstone. She draped the burgundy velvet over it, pinning it loosely at the base, then reached for the steaming kettle that sat on a small spirit stove in the corner. Steam rose in a white plume as she held the fabric over it, and the velvet softened, relaxed, became willing. This was the moment that separated a milliner from a seamstress, the understanding that fabric has a memory and that steam is the language you use to rewrite it. Slowly, carefully, she stretched the velvet over the block, smoothing it with the palms of her hands, coaxing it into the shape she wanted. The fabric resisted at first, as it always did, then yielded, conforming to the curves of the wood like water finding its level. There was a moment, and every milliner knew it, when the fabric stopped fighting and began to cooperate, when it seemed to understand what you were asking of it and said yes. Rosemary lived for that moment. She pinned it in place and left it to cool and set. While she waited, she prepared the brim. She cut a wide crescent of buckram, the stiff fabric that would give the brim its structure, and covered it with a second piece of velvet, pressing it smooth with a warm iron. The smell of heated fabric filled the workshop, rich and faintly sweet, mixing with the woody scent of the blocks and the distant perfume of the artificial flowers on the shelves. Then came the trimming. Rosemary laid the 3 ostrich plumes on the work table and studied them, turning each one slowly, watching how the barbs caught the light. She selected the longest for the center, the 2 shorter ones for the sides, and began to stitch them into place with tiny, invisible stitches. Her needle moved in and out of the velvet with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat, and the workshop fell into a deep, contented silence, broken only by the soft sound of thread passing through fabric and the occasional sigh of the fire. She added the gold ribbon next, wrapping it around the base of the crown in a wide band, folding it into a flat bow at the back. The ribbon was stiff and lustrous, and it caught the light from the window in a way that made the whole hat seem to glow from within. Then came the glass beads, dark garnet, each one no larger than a seed, sewn one by one along the edge of the ribbon like a constellation of tiny stars. This was the work that made Rosemary's hands ache by evening, the work that required a steady eye and endless patience, but it was also the work that separated a good hat from an extraordinary one. Daisy watched from the other side of the table, her chin resting in her hands, her eyes following every stitch. "How do you know when it is finished?" Daisy asked. Rosemary did not look up. "You will know," she said, "because it will stop asking you for things." In the late afternoon, when the light was beginning to turn gold, Rosemary set down her needle and reached for the teapot. This was their ritual, tea at 4, no matter what. She poured 2 cups, handed one to Daisy, and settled into the old armchair by the window. "Your Aunt Nell," Daisy said, blowing on her tea. "You have spoken of her before." "Was she a milliner too?" "The best I ever knew," Rosemary said. "She had a shop on Cheapside, not as fine as this one, smaller, darker, but the women who came to her would not go anywhere else. She understood something that I did not learn until years later." "What was that?" Rosemary looked out of the window at the rooftops of London, gold in the late light. "That every woman who walks through that door is asking you the same question. They might ask for a hat for Ascot, or a bonnet for church, or a travelling hat for the railway. But what they are really asking is, can you help me feel like myself? Can you show me the version of myself that I cannot quite see? She sipped her tea. Aunt Nell taught me for 7 years how to block, how to steam, how to stitch. But the most important thing she taught me had nothing to do with hats. She taught me to look, really look, at the person standing in front of me. The bell above the door chimed, and both women looked up. Miss Charlotte Webb stood in the entrance of the shop, as though she were not entirely sure she was allowed to be there. She was 20 years old, with chestnut hair tucked under a plain brown bonnet, and she held her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as though she were trying to make herself smaller. Her dress was clean but simple, her boots sensible, and there was something in her eyes, a kind of nervous hunger, that Rosemary recognized immediately. "Good afternoon," Rosemary said warmly, rising from behind the counter. "Welcome. Please come in." Charlotte took a few steps forward, her eyes moving over the hats displayed on their stands. Emerald, coral, sapphire, gold, with an expression that was equal parts wonder and uncertainty. "I was wondering," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "if you might help me choose a hat for a special occasion." "Of course," Rosemary said. "What kind of occasion?" Charlotte's cheeks flushed pink. A gentleman has asked me to walk with him in the park on Sunday, and I have nothing. I mean, I have my bonnet, but it is so plain, and I thought perhaps—" She trailed off, looking down at her hands. Rosemary came around the counter and took Charlotte gently by the elbow, guiding her to the fitting chair. First, she said, "Let us have a look at you. May I?" Charlotte nodded, and Rosemary carefully removed the brown bonnet. Underneath, Charlotte's hair was lovely, thick and chestnut brown with a natural wave, but it had been pulled back so tightly that it seemed to be apologizing for existing. Rosemary studied Charlotte's face for a long moment. Then she turned to the shelves and began to select hats, one by one, setting them on the table. The first was a wide-brimmed creation in scarlet with a cascade of silk roses. Charlotte looked at it and shook her head immediately. "Oh no," she said, "that is far too bold." "I could never." Rosemary said nothing, only set it aside. The second was a straw boater with a navy ribbon. Smart, practical. Charlotte considered it, then sighed. "It is nice," she said, "but it does not feel right." The third was a small, elegant hat in dove grey silk. The fabric Rosemary had bought that morning without knowing why, trimmed with a cluster of silk violets and a wisp of ivory lace. It was not grand. It was not dramatic. It was, Rosemary thought, exactly like a quiet sentence that says more than a shout. She placed it on Charlotte's head, adjusting the angle slightly, tilted just a fraction to the right so that it framed the left side of her face and let the violets rest near her cheekbone. "There," Rosemary said softly. "Now look." Charlotte turned to the mirror and stopped. The young woman staring back at her was not the Charlotte who had walked in. The Charlotte with the too tight hair and the apologetic eyes, and the hands that would not stop clasping and unclasping. This Charlotte had colour in her cheeks. This Charlotte's eyes were wide and bright. This Charlotte looked for the first time as though she belonged exactly where she was. Oh, Charlotte breathed. Daisy, who had been watching from the doorway of the workshop, pressed her hands together and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The hat does not make you beautiful, dear, Rosemary said quietly. It simply introduces the world to the beauty that was always there. Charlotte touched the brim with trembling fingers, as though she were afraid it might vanish. She looked at herself from one side, then the other, then straight on. And slowly, so slowly, that it was like watching a flower open, she smiled. "I will take it," she said. Her voice was different now, not louder, but steadier, as though something inside her had found its footing. And then, so quietly that Rosemary almost did not hear it, she added, "Thank you, not just for the hat." Rosemary reached out and gently straightened the ribbon at the back. "You are very welcome, Miss Webb. Wear it well." When Charlotte left the shop, the bell chiming softly behind her, she was walking differently. Her back was straight, her chin was lifted, and the little dove-grey hat sat on her head as though it had been waiting for her all along. Rosemary watched her through the window until she disappeared into the evening crowd, and she felt that particular warmth again, the warmth that came not from fires or tea or sunshine, but from knowing that you had done the thing you were put on this earth to do. The evening settled over London like a velvet cloth, soft and dark and heavy with the scent of rain. Rosemary lit the candles in the workshop and sat down at the work table for the final hours of the day. Mrs. Harrington's hat was nearly complete. The burgundy velvet glowed in the candlelight, rich and deep as wine, and the 3 ostrich plumes rose from the crown like smoke frozen in silk. The gold ribbon caught the flame and threw tiny sparks of light across the walls. It was, Rosemary thought, a hat that demanded attention, which was precisely what Mrs. Harrington wanted. She made the last few stitches, securing a plume, tightening a bead, and then reached for her smallest needle and a length of crimson thread. This was the part that no one ever saw. She turned the hat over, found the smooth space inside the crown where the lining met the band, and began to stitch. A tiny rose, no larger than her thumbnail, with 5 petals and a curling stem. It took her perhaps 10 minutes, and when she was finished, she held the hat up and looked at it. Aunt Nell had signed her hats too, not with a rose, but with a small embroidered acorn. Every milliner has a secret, she had told Rosemary Fire once, something that belongs only to you and the hat and the woman who wears it. It is your way of saying, "I made this. I was here. My hands touched this thing, and I left a piece of myself inside it." Rosemary set the hat on its stand, blew out all but 1 candle, and sat by the window for a moment before closing the shop. Below, Burlington Arcade was quiet now, its gas lamps casting pools of amber light on the wet pavement. A hansom cab clattered past on Piccadilly, and somewhere in the distance a church bell was counting the hour. She thought about Charlotte, walking home through the evening streets with her new hat, her back a little straighter, her step a little lighter. She wondered about the gentleman who had asked Charlotte to walk with him in the park on Sunday, and whether he would notice the way the dove-grey silk brought out the warmth in her eyes, and whether Charlotte would stand a little taller beside him, and whether she would finally begin to believe what Rosemary had told her, that the beauty had always been there, waiting. She thought about Mrs. Harrington, who would wear the burgundy creation to Ascot in June and feel like the most important woman at the racecourse. She thought about Daisy, who would one day have a workshop of her own with her own row of wooden blocks and her own secret signature stitched inside every hat. And she thought about Aunt Nell, who had died 3 winters ago and left Rosemary the shop and the blocks and the little brass scissors that still sat in the top drawer of the work table. Aunt Nell, who had never married either, who had built her own life stitch by stitch, and who had taught Rosemary that a hat is never just a hat. It is a question answered. It is a door opened. It is the moment when a woman looks in the mirror and sees not who she has been told she is, but who she knows herself to be. Rosemary smiled in the darkness. She whispered a quiet thank you to the empty room, to Aunt Nell, to the hats, to the wooden blocks standing in their patient row, and then she rose from her chair, blew out the last candle, and locked the door behind her. And so, dear visitor, that is the story of the little hat with the hidden rose. Miss Rosemary Plunkett, milliner, artist, keeper of a very particular kind of magic. She never married, not because no one asked, but because she had already found the great love of her life, and it was made of silk and velvet and straw and feathers and the look on a woman's face when she sees herself clearly for the first time. The milliners, they were artists, every one of them. They could look at a woman's face and know, within moments, what shape and colour and angle would bring her to life. They worked with materials that came from every corner of the world. Straw from Italy, silk from China, feathers from Africa. And they transformed them into something that was more than the sum of its parts, something that gave a woman permission to be herself. Here, let me put the hat back on its shelf now, where it can dream of Burlington Arcade and the smell of steam and velvet and the soft sound of scissors cutting through silk. It has earned its rest. You know, there is something I think about often on evenings like this. We remember the grand things, the cathedrals, the bridges, the speeches that changed the world. But we forget the quiet things, the things that happened in small workshops, above shops, by candlelight, with a needle and thread and a pair of steady hands. The milliners of London did not build monuments. They built something far more fragile and far more powerful. They built the moment when a person becomes brave enough to be seen. Now then, dear visitor, the hour grows late, and the fire is settling into its embers. The rain has stopped, I think. Yes, there it is. The silence that comes when the rain decides it has said enough. Let me walk you to the door. Sleep well tonight, dear friend. And if you should happen to pass a milliner's shop tomorrow, do stop and look in the window. Look at the hats on their stands and remember that each one is a story waiting to be worn. Each one is a little act of faith that the right hat worn by the right person on the right day can change everything. Rest well, dear visitor. The shop will be here when you return.